The Harlem Renaissance and Pan-Africanism reflected just one aspect of a broader cultural awakening. News traveled fast in the 1920s, and new means of communications hastened the spread of national culture. Across the country, people attended the same movies, read the same books, followed the same sports teams, and shared the same instant heroes. The new technologies of radio and the movies helped spread American culture around the globe. Especially in Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere, new media fortified people's ideas of the U.S. as a huge, rich land. The new culture may have been highly popular, but many Americans were dismayed by the new trends. Some religious people expressed disappointment and outrage at what they considered to be the immorality of the new consumerist age. The 1927 film The Jazz Singer marked the greatest technological breakthrough of the decade as the first talkie with extended dialogue. Many movies of the 1920s reflected the tensions of this, quote, new era. As films provided a glimpse into the lives of the rich and famous, Hollywood soon began to shape national and international perceptions about fashion, etiquette, morals, and success. The movie's portrayal of unheard of wealth and high fashion may have had an even greater impact on people's ideas of American life around the globe than it did in the US. At home, at least, people could compare their own rather ordinary lives to the images on the screen. They enjoyed the fantasy, but they knew it was just that, an unrealistic depiction of life. Internationally, American movies offered a tantalizing glimpse of a rich land populated with beautiful people wrapped in finery. Westerns and romances featuring beautiful young city dwellers proved especially popular abroad. But not everyone appreciated the effect cinema's popularity had on traditional values. Facing pressure from conservative groups, in 1921, the movie studios appointed Postmaster General Will Hayes to censor their films. Hayes prohibited risque content on the screen and monitored appropriate behavior for actors and actresses off the screen. An unparalleled interest in sports also skyrocketed several athletes into superstardom during the 1920s. Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees established himself as a larger-than-life figure, and fans flocked to professional baseball games. Hitting 60 home runs during the Yankees' dominant 1927 season, the Sultan of Swat set a record that would stand for more than 30 years. Ruth's gregarious, infectious personality off the field likewise endeared him to fans. Professional football player Harold Red Grange, boxer Jack Dempsey, tennis player Will Tilden, and golfer Bobby Jones likewise drew millions of fans during the decade. Huge crowds turned out for college football games. To the dismay of those who worried that too much attention to athletes would sidetrack the academic mission of higher education, several universities, including Yale, Ohio State, and Stanford, began building stadiums that held more than 60,000 people. And by the end of the decade, more fans attended college football games than professional baseball games. With more leisure time on their hands and money in their pockets, many sought to emulate their favorite athletes by participating in sports as well as by watching them. For example, by 1927, the U.S. had approximately 5,000 golf courses and 2 million players. The 1920s was also a decade of instant celebrity. No one symbolized the spirit of the new era better than the boyishly handsome 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh, who collected a $25,000 cash prize for being the first aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. Radio reporters breathlessly announced every minute of his 33-hour flight from Long Island to Paris in May of that year. As a goodwill ambassador, Lindbergh, or Lucky Lindy as he was called, promoted American aviation around the world. Tragedy engulfed his family in 1932 when his 2-year-old son was kidnapped and murdered. Lindbergh's reputation also suffered a severe blow in the late 1930s when he sympathized with Nazi Germany and opposed American entry into World War II. Despite the general prosperity of the 1920s, not all Americans considered the U.S. a happy home. Some lost faith in traditional American values and grew alienated after the experience of World War I. Many writers and artists fled to Europe, especially France, where they hoped to live a more authentic existence. Other intellectuals remained in the U.S., but wrote scathing critiques of what they saw as the emptiness of mainstream, middle-class American culture. Many of the intellectuals who left the US for Europe in the 1920s, the so-called lost generation, had become disillusioned with the present-day society and its ideas of progress. In his 1929 book, A Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway wrote, quote, "The war annihilated all reason, virtue, and human compassion," end quote. Additionally, Hemingway and those who joined him in Paris, most notably F. Scott Fitzgerald, found life in the U.S. stifling, puritanical, driven by big business, and full of hypocrisy. In Paris, they directly challenged those values, enjoyed a less inhibited lifestyle, and began writing some of the decade's most influential works. Regardless of the critique of literary expatriates, the 1920s was also a time of great artistic creativity in the U.S. In 1920, Sinclair Lewis began the charge by attacking small-town life in Main Street. His incisive criticism of the bigotry and shallowness of middle-class America struck a chord, and the novel became a national bestseller. In 1922, Lewis followed with Babbitt, an even greater success that satirized business culture. F. Scott Fitzgerald also addressed the hollow, unfulfilling lifestyle of the rich in The Great Gatsby. The loudest voice of social criticism during the 1920s came from Baltimore-based journalist H.L. Mencken. In 1924, he launched the American Mercury, a magazine that served as the vehicle for Mencken's piercing attacks on rural life, popular culture, religion, democracy, politicians, and what he called the bourgeoisie. Mencken coined the derogatory moniker Monkey Trial for the Scopes Evolution trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, and led the charge of journalists there to create a circus-like atmosphere. He was especially popular among college students who imitated his irreverence. One Harvard student remarked, quote, "The American Mercury was our Bible, and Mencken our God," end quote. Just as jazz signified the 1920s, the flapper symbolized the new woman of that decade. She wore short skirts, cultivated a boyish figure, rouged her cheeks, bobbed her hair, and turned down her flesh-colored stockings. She smoked cigarettes in public, drank alcohol, danced the shimmy in jazz clubs, and flirted openly with her male playmates. Her behavior, scandalous by her mother's standards, represented, quote, "feminism, new style," end quote, according to an observer. Often indifferent to women's organizations and causes such as suffrage and equal rights that had helped bond her mother's generation, the flapper stressed her individuality and freedom. Clara Bow, who was known as the It Girl, epitomized the flapper new woman of the 1920s. It was a quality of magnetic personality and physical attraction, as well as self-confidence. With boyishly tousled bobbed hair, big brown eyes, and heart-shaped mouth, she was the biggest Hollywood star of the era, and women in the U.S. and abroad copied her, quote, "jazz baby style." The flapper became a jazz-age female ideal replicated around the world, especially through movies and broadly circulated American magazines such as Judge, Puck, Vanity Fair, Life, and McClure's. The flapper featured prominently in movies such as A Social Celebrity and Rolled Stockings. The pleasure-seeking flapper embodied a new understanding of female sexuality in the 1920s. As youth culture expanded, with more young men and women attending high schools and co-ed colleges and universities, young Americans developed new ways of dating and interacting. New theories of sexuality, such as those posited by Sigmund Freud, stressed female pleasure and condemned, quote, "inhibitions" as unhealthy. Birth control also became more accessible. Liberated from the supervision of parents and chaperones, young men and women exercised their sexual freedom, engaged in petting parties, and enjoyed the privacy of automobile back seats. Despite a rebellious image, the new woman of the 1920s continued to embrace many traditional values. Marriage generally remained her end goal, the means to personal fulfillment. Almost all Americans considered, quote, "normal sex" to be heterosexual and occurring within marriage. As women contended to land a husband, female relationships often became rivalries. Advertisements, which used female sexuality to market all kinds of items, accentuated female competition. Ads, for example, tried to convince women that they needed to purchase beauty products to vie successfully for a husband and to keep him. Sales of cosmetics exploded in the 1920s, and the Miss America Beauty Contest, first held in 1921, embodied the competitive dimension of the new womanhood as young women contended to represent the American ideal of beauty. Despite her pervasive image, the flapper was not the only, quote, new woman in the 1920s. Movies and magazines also glamorized the modern working girl. Secretarial work, once the province of young businessmen on their way up the corporate ladder, became a respectable job for young, middle-class white women in the 1920s. But this kind of work was viewed not as a career, but only as a temporary phase before marriage and a return to the home. For working-class women, the carefree flapper, the college co-ed, the glamorous working girl, or even the contented housewife rarely reflected their lives. Most working women in the 1920s remained in the occupations they had held previously, such as domestic service, agricultural labor, and certain kinds of manufacturing jobs. White women from the southern countryside labored in increasingly harsh conditions in textile mills. Most black women toiled in domestic service jobs. Puerto Rican and Cuban women produced clothing and cigars in urban sweatshops, while the majority of Mexican immigrant women worked as domestics or agricultural workers. Yet even among women in remote parts of the country, the flapper made an impact. Southern mill girls, for example, bobbed their hair, listened to jazz on the radio, danced the shimmy, and saved their money for cosmetics and stylish dresses.